Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit more into selection and the selection manager. So here's an example of a selection callback that we wrote, and you can see we're using the set callbacks method that we talked about earlier. We set the tag of selection, and then we set our callback function. So our callback function is pretty simple. So this selection event that is passed into us is basically, it's just like a wrapper around some particular information that describes our selection. So for example, we can get things like face ID, the line ID, the edge ID, the node ID, all these different IDs from something that we have selected. And a couple things to note about this selection callback is it can happen in a number of ways. So it can happen from the user performing a click. That's the most common, click or touch on a part, okay? Or it can happen from a programmatic action. So for example, let's say you have a model tree on the side of your view and you click on your model tree. Now this model tree is outside of the realm of Communicator. It's some JavaScript object, but you want to highlight or you want to have some sort of visual indication that something is now selected. So maybe your model tree, and it's on click handler, it will call select part on a particular node. So you'll also get a selection event that fires from Communicator on that. And the idea being that maybe you have a bunch of different UI components that all do something on selection. So maybe you have like a box on the side that will update the properties for a particular node that's selected. So essentially all your components that deal with selection only need to listen to one callback. You don't have to kind of wire up your property inspector to your model tree and all this. Like everything can just listen to the selection callback, and no matter how an item is selected, they will all be notified of that event. So you can imagine in your, say, your property window, in its selection callback, it would grab the node ID from the selection, and it would call like model get properties, okay? Or maybe you have something that, I don't know, for whatever reason, just outputs the position of something that's selected. In its selection callback, it would call, get matrix, and it would extract the translate out of that. So again, kind of like we talked about with the operators, allowing you to have a particular operator that did one thing, you can also have multiple callbacks bound to a specific type that all do one thing and all kind of work independently. So in this case, we're just getting the position of the selection. Meaning, so in this case, this get position refers to the point in world space of the selection. So maybe click on the face of a cube, it's that particular point. And we can look at the docs and see there's lots of different things you can get on the selection type, or on the selection object. Okay, so we have this selection callback that gives us back a selection object, but we also have a utility class called the selection manager, which helps us work with multiple selection objects and also controls some selection properties. So here we kind of outline some of the selection manager methods that a lot of people use. So for example, when you click on a part, it will highlight that entire part one color, but it'll also highlight the face, the particular CAD face that you clicked on in a separate color. So you can change the colors of all the different selections. You can also change the mode. Maybe you don't want to highlight that particular face. Maybe you only want to highlight the face. So the selection manager is your window into controlling how the selection is conveyed to the user. So, for example, in addition to that, we can also set the tolerances of certain things. So the how it looks and how we actually do the selection. Now the selection manager also has some additional methods for working with groups of selection objects. So if you wanted to iterate over all of them to see what are all the nodes I have selected, or maybe I want to see like what lines do I have selected. So it also provides some methods for doing that as well. Let's take a quick look at the selection manager example here. Okay, so here we just have an example of how we get the selection manager. So we just call it right from our viewer object, and then we can just address, or we can just call these methods right off it. And we can see here we've hooked up these functions to basically be called by different buttons. So when you click the button, it would get the selection manager from the viewer and then call a particular method. So let's also talk a little bit about how to pick programmatically. So there's two things. So we talked about the case of like a model tree, and we're selecting a particular node. Okay, and this, when you select a particular node, there's a lot of information that we don't have, right? We don't have like the exact point that you picked because we're selecting a node. But you can also pick programmatically, and this is probably something that you're used to doing. Basically, you're reading the mouse position, and then you're picking from that mouse position. And what we're doing behind the scenes is that we're going to cast an array from your pick location into the world, and we're going to create a selection from that. And that allows us to test against lines or faces or points. And that will provide a complete selection object for us to work with. So to reiterate here, so two types of programmatic picking, one on a node level and one on from a point. And one other thing to kind of keep in mind here is that when you select on a node level programmatically, that you're also going to select any children of that node. Okay, so that's not something you can do with picking from a point. So if you want to select, you had a building, we'll go back to our building example where we had this tree where each floor was a particular node, then we can programmatically pick floor 1, which will sort of highlight everything, and then along with all the children. But if we were to pick from a point and just pick on one thing on that particular floor, we would have to use the API to walk up the model tree to get what floor it is. So just one thing to keep in mind. And the selection, picking programmatically will create potentially multiple selection objects if you pick on a node for the things that are under it. But if you pick from a point, you always only get one. That most specific.